Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. And I'll be giving this lecture in English because I wrote it in English. Last week I gave a lecture in Dutch because my lecture, which I wrote last week, was in English, but it turned out that everyone was Dutch. Today I'll do it in English because I was requested to do it in English for the sake of the recordings. My first question for all of you is, how many of you are humanities students? Which is a large majority, I think, more or less. I'll be talking about humanities today, and what I'll be doing is, I'll be doing something quite different from what I did last week. Last week I gave something that was labeled a pep talk, and rightly so, I think. A pep talk in Dutch which addressed the situation of Rethink UU and the situation of Leiden and Amsterdam concerning the project of rethinking the structure of the university. Today I'll be doing something quite different. I'll be giving a contemplative and reflective lecture on the history of the humanities, or at least of a specific part of the history of the humanities. So what I'll be doing today, I'll be talking about something that came up last week, and this is the concept of repressive tolerance. Now, as most of you will know, the concept of repressive tolerance, which was coined by Marcuse in 1965, the concept of repressive tolerance was introduced in the wake of March 13, so exactly two weeks ago, when the central administration, the College van Bestuur from the University of Amsterdam, sent out a statement in which they largely, or at least if you're a felicitous reader, from which it largely seemed as if they were willing to negotiate and adopt some of the themes and issues that the Rethink UvA and the Occupy Maagdenhuis occupants of the Maagdenhuis had addressed and had demanded, the list of 10 demands, which you're probably familiar. Now, what I'd like to do today is I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into that concept of repressive tolerance. And the reason why I want to do that is because I think that we can learn a lot from looking into that concept of repressive tolerance. And specifically, we can learn a lot about what the humanities are about, and why humanities as a field of study is, I think, a relevant field to contemporary society. And why humanities doesn't necessarily mean protection of small languages, which includes Dutch, which is why I do this lecture in Dutch, in English instead of Dutch, even though I'll be talking about Dutch history a lot, as I'm teaching in the Dutch Studies department. So my lecture is divided into 3 parts, which are equally divided into about 10 minutes, a little less actually, starting from the moment I started to speak. And the first part is a discussion of the concept of repressive tolerance, for which we'll be delving into Marcuse's essay from 1965 on repressive tolerance. Then the second part, I'd like to take you on a sort of a story. I'd like to tell you a story. I'd like to take you on a journey, and this journey concerns the history of this country and the origins of the concept of tolerance in the early 17th century. But it won't only be about the history of the 17th century and the Dutch history of the 17th century. I also would be addressing contemporary history. Having done so, I'll end my lecture with a reflection on what it means to produce knowledge, and what knowledge production can be, and what its essence is. So let me begin by talking about the Marcuse part. Marcuse on repressive tolerance, and it would certainly be a mistake to argue that Marcuse's concept of repressive tolerance is a critique of tolerance as such. It is not. However, for the sake of the arguments that I wish to make, and for considering the time frame I'm in, I'll approach it as such, and I'll look at how Marcuse criticizes tolerance, the concept of tolerance, defines it as repressive tolerance, and once we've understood how that works, I think we can understand what the differences are between our times and Marcuse's times, because I don't think the concept of repressive tolerance is necessarily very useful at this point in time. So, what is repressive tolerance about in Marcuse? Well, the concept of tolerance stems, Marcuse argues, from a liberal tradition. We'll have a look at that liberal tradition in the next section of my talk. but it stemmed from a liberal tradition, and that liberal tradition of political thought is based on a specific understanding of the individual. And that specific understanding of the individual is as follows. An individual, it says, is a free individual. In other words, an individual is, by and of itself, not necessarily or not primarily shaped by society. It's shaped by its own will, its own ideas, and its own rationality. Now, Marcuse attacks this claim, as have done many authors from the 1960s who've been involved in the student revolutions of the 1960s. So here is Marcuse. He says, liberalist tolerance, and I quote, was based on the proposition that men were potential individuals who could learn to hear and see and feel by themselves, to develop their own thoughts, to grasp their true interests and rights and capabilities, also against established authority and opinion. This was the rationale, Marcuse concludes, of free speech and assembly. However, Marcuse suggests, the idea of the free individual is deceptive. Individual subjects and their political and social insights are the result, he argues, of formative forces, shaping forces of society, a community, a group, and its corresponding political apparatus, such as the government, jurisdiction, the media, and so on. So, according to Marcuse, the principle of tolerance is false. Now, as soon as you've dismantled this principle of tolerance, which is the supposedly free individual, as soon as you've criticized that, you haven't really said anything yet. And Marcuse understands this very well. So he continues his argument by going one step further, which is, I think, the crucial step for us to understand. And this step is as follows. He says, well, suppose that indeed we acknowledge that an individual is not free, that an individual is shaped by society's forces, by media, by jurisdiction, by law, by family situations, etc., etc. Even if this is true, it might still be possible to maintain the liberal conception of tolerance, with a little twist though. Because we could argue that in an ideal situation, we could think about the political theory of John Rawls. In an ideal situation, we would have an assemblage of forces, political forces, media forces, jurisdiction, so juridical forces and laws and rights we have. And ideally, they would all come together in such a way that the individual receives just the right amount of discordance, just the right amount of counter-arguments so that it's able to shape itself, that is able to be shaped by society in a critical way, so that we shape individuals in order to become critical individuals, even if they're shaped, even if they are the result of the formative forces of society. Even then, we could argue that this individual is free as an end product. Well, this is something that Marcuse understands very well, that this is the counter-argument from the liberalists. So he takes the argument one step further, and he says, well, this might be true. However, and here I quote Marcuse again, one might, in theory, construct a state in which a multitude of different pressures, interests, and authorities, balance each other out and result in a truly general and rational interest. However, he continues, such a construction badly fits a society in which powers are and remain unequal. So it badly fits a society in which powers are and remain unequal, Marcuse argues, and even increase their unequal weight when they run their own course. It fits even worse, he continues, and this is important, it fits even worse when the variety of pressures unifies and coagulates, when the variety of pressures, so we've got different sorts of pressures, political, media, jurisdiction, when the variety of pressures unifies and coagulates into an overwhelming whole, integrating the particular countervailing powers by virtue of an increasing standard of living and an increasing concentration of power. Now, what is Marcuse saying? He's giving us two counter-arguments to the liberal conception of a formed individual. He says, first of all, these powers, when they run their own course, they are bent against the idea of a critical free individual. Whether or not this is true, I'll leave aside for the moment. I wish to focus on the second counter-argument. The second counter-argument argues that what we're witnessing today, and we're talking 1965, is a situation in which, through what Marcuse calls the affluent democracy, he takes this from the concept that was very popular in those days of the affluent society, the golden age, the economic boom of the 60s. In an affluent democracy, there is room for all ideas and all insights. So he argues, well, you can have communists and fascists and the left and the right and the white and the Negro, the crusader for armament and for disarmament. Mind you, he was writing in 1965, hence the lingo. But so he argues all of these things have a room in society. So what's the problem? The problem is that by incorporating them into the prevailing system, he argues, they lose their difference. They lose their the fact that they're truly different. So what they do is they unify and coagulate. And now this is what repressive tolerance is about. Repressive tolerance is about a formal procedure in which we see that not the content of what is being expressed by fascists, communists, civil rights participants, or students revolting for a better university. Not the content of it is simply appropriate. The content itself is given a place inside of the system. And by giving it a place inside of the system, the result is that it loses its difference. And losing its difference, it becomes unified, it becomes part of the system. And as a result of that, it not only unifies, it starts to coagulate. It starts to lose its idea of tolerance. It's no longer tolerance, which is why Marcuse begins his essay, and this is where I'll conclude my section on Marcuse. He begins his essay by saying that there are certain things in society that should not be tolerated. That we've extended the limits and measures of tolerance up to such an extent that we're now living in an intolerant society. The question that was on my mind, though, is this relevant for today? Is this relevant for students and teachers requesting a participatory democracy within university? I think I'll leave it to you to reflect on that, but I'll give you a few suggestions. I don't think it's very relevant at this point in time. But I think it's relevant to understand, to look at this, and then compare it to our own situation. I think our own situation has been marked by two major events that have been unfolded over the last decade and a half. And these are pretty obvious. The first one is 9/11, and specifically in the wake of that, the war on terror, and what this has done to security and to security agencies like the CIA. And secondly, the global financial meltdown of 2008 and what this has done to the financial markets. Instead of binding these markets to more laws, it has actually revamped these markets, has recontinued these markets and their authority over democracy. And it certainly indicates that we're not living in an affluent society in the same sense as Marcuse was arguing that we live in an affluent society. What has been happening the last few decades is we've seen that as a result of the war on terror, we need specialists. And those specialists are better off not sharing their information with everyone, with the entire community. If they do so, they put themselves and the community at risk. So we have, on the one hand, the idea we need specialists to understand the war on terror, we need specialists to understand the global crisis, the global financial meltdown. On the other hand, we also have, trust us, we cannot share all the information we have with you, says the CIA, says et cetera, the IFED. And trust us, you're not able to understand the complex procedures and mathematical underpinnings of global financial capitalism. So leave it to us. And certainly not to the humanities. So this is not a sharing of knowledge, this is not repressive tolerance, it's literally keeping us out of the door. It's literally keeping us out of the inside of what we're trying deal with. Now, that is not surprising in itself. And this is the second part of my lecture. I'd like to take you back to, I'd like to tell you a little something about the history of the Netherlands. Anyone of you familiar with what happened in 1609? You should, if you're studying Dutch, but you're not, I assume. In 1609, the 12-year truce began. And let me tell you a little bit about the 12-year truce. The 12-year truce was the result of a relentless diplomatic effort of Johan van Oldenbarneveld. I'm sure you know Johan van Oldenbarneveld, and let me check the time. Johan van Oldenbarneveld brokered a 12-year truce, or at least he brokered a peace, starting in 1609, and it would last until 1621. 12-year truce, it was called after that. Now, this created a relative stability in this country. The result of that was that all of a sudden there was room and space for religious infights. And indeed, religious infights, which had been soaring over the past few decades, began in the Netherlands. More concretely, in 1603, at Leiden University arrived a man called Arminius, who was born not far from here in the province of Utrecht. And Arminius was rather a liberal theologian. Arminius believed that the strict ideas about Protestantism that Calvin adhered to, and which Calvinists from the Netherlands had adhered to up until then, should not be taken that strict, that there should be room for discussion. In other words, he was advocating, inadvertently perhaps, a notion of tolerance, which had already been developed by Cornhart in the previous century and some others, and which will be continued to be developed by, amongst others, Spinoza, and then in the second half of the 17th century by the English, for example, John Locke's Letter on Tolerance from 1681. Okay, all of this is a lot of information. Don't worry, you don't need to keep this in mind as such. Let's have a look at this struggle. What was the struggle about? Arminius was rather liberal, and Gomarius, who was also part of the Leiden University theology faculty, was not so amused by what Arminius had to say. The result of that was a religious infight that took on gigantic proportions. And it was about whether or not we should tolerate freedom of religion. Now, why is this important for the humanities? Well, if you look at the debate, something really special happens. We've got two documents, and the first one was the Union of Utrecht. And the Union of Utrecht was devised in 1579, if I'm not mistaken, yes, 1579, January 23rd. And it stated that the provinces that were united now against Spain, asking for their independence, would only be united for the sake of their common purpose of fighting off the yoke of Spain, of the Habsburg Empire. And it also stated that when it came to matters of religion and more in general freedom of expression, so when it came to matters of tolerance, they would not meddle with each other's affairs. So scholars in favor of tolerance argue that this was the document we should be looking at. This was the draft document of the Constitution of the Netherlands that we should be looking at. On the other hand, you'd have those like Gomarius who argued that's not quite correct, because in 1562 we've had the Confessio Belgica, which is basically the draft for the Reformed Church in the Netherlands, written by Guy de Brès. And Guy de Brès outlined the principles of tolerance, outlined the principle of the Reformation, the Dutch Reformation, and every province should strictly adhere to this. So what do we have here? We have a weighing of words, a fight between two kinds of words. Now, the reason why this is relevant, I think, is first of all, and this leads me to the end of my talk, first of all because this concept of tolerance was shaped as a result of these two constitutions. And we don't only have, so reading these constitutions and reading these two treatises is not just a matter of theology. It's a matter of theology, to be sure. It's not just a matter of jurisdiction and law. It's surely a matter of jurisdiction and law, yes. But it's also a matter of politics, as we can see. Now, the whole issue was solved in 1619 with the Synod of Dort, which gave Gomarius and his reformative church the benefit of the doubt, you could say, and Arminius was posthumously convicted of being treason, of being an heretic. And in the wake of that, Maurice of Nassau, the predecessor of our current kings, put up a kangaroo trial and kangaroo court and trialed Johan van Barneveld, who supported Arminius, and van Oldenbarneveld was executed. Now the story continues because the concept of tolerance was later reworked in the 17th century by the English, specifically by John Locke. And from John Locke, it moved on to the Americas. And when, in 1802, in America, a discussion was uphand about the relation between church and state, something specific came out of that. Adams wrote that he wished to tear up or draw up a wall between state and religion. In other words, this concept of tolerance, it started to travel. We're talking 1802 now. We're getting closer to our own time. It starts to travel, and it starts to be reworked. Okay, this is all very well. So what have we done now? We've established that the humanities are relevant when it comes to reading different kind of texts and reading them closely and how these texts are performed and how they work in the world. And then we've seen how they have become a guiding notion for the shaping of the Constitution of the Americas, of the United States of America. Now, the United States of America have been a very powerful nation for the past 200 years, and they probably will continue to do this, to be powerful for a couple of more decades, given their military power. But in 1945, let's move to 1945. What happens in 1945? The United States invade Japan, or at least invade Japan, capture Japan, whatever way you want to put it. So what happens there? Japan is a specific case because in 1868, at the end of the Boshin War, which is an important war for Japan because it basically unified Japan and introduced a modern Japanese empire that lasted up until 1945 with the emperor, etc., etc. In 1945, the Americans walked in and they came to the conclusion that the people of Japan and the state of Japan had a so-called state religion. And this state religion was none other than what they would call, what the Americans called state Shinto. Now, the Japanese did not call this state Shinto. It's true, after the Boshin War, so at the late 19th century, in order to facilitate the unification of Japan, Shinto as a religion was introduced in Japan, or at least was propagated in Japan to create this unification also on a cultural level. But it wasn't exactly a state religion. Nevertheless, the Americans concluded this is a state religion. Okay, fine. You'll have to redraft your constitution so as to make sure that there's no such thing as the meddlement of state and religion. And so it went, so it goes. Let's move to 1978. In 1978, the Shinto shrine of Yasukuni in the heart of Tokyo, right next to the Imperial Palace. In 1978, the high priest of the Shinto shrine of Yasukuni enshrined 12 Class A war criminals in the Shinto shrine. So 12 Class A war criminals, which were investigated, which were deeply embedded into the massive slaughtering of the Chinese people and the Korean people, were enshrined in this Shinto ritual, in the Shinto shrine of Yasukuni. Not surprisingly, Japan received criticism from China and from Korea, and in general from international forces. So China requested that Japan would redraw its enshrinement, that these 12 Class A war criminals would be taken out of the Yasukuni shrine. And what does Japan say? I'm sorry, there's no meddlement between church and state in this country. No can do. So what we see is this concept of tolerance starts to travel. It starts to travel from the Dutch situation to the English situation to the American situation, and finally from the American situation through to the situation of Japan. And finally, an international global affair, which is still raging, by the way. The whole Shinto shrine of Yasukuni comes up again every August. It's a controversy that is of major importance in the Far East. In other words, what am I trying to say here? And this brings me to my concluding section on the knowledge production. What I'm trying to say here is that the reason why the humanities are important is not because we should be defending small languages. It's never been about small languages. Don't be so conservative. It's not about small languages unless you wish to adhere to this Humboldtian, Western, Eurocentric perspective, etc., etc. I personally don't. But it is about small languages as well. It's about learning languages. But it's about learning languages in relation to politics and jurisdiction, and so law, and about international affairs, such as the China-Japan controversy. And the reason why I told you this story is because I think it shows us that if you delve into the history of words such as tolerance and concepts such as tolerance, and you're willing, from a humanities perspective, to take into consideration the political ramifications of it, the juridical ramifications of it, you'll see that by reading closely and by reading attentively, as a humanities scholar, you can shed new light on issues concerning international affairs, concerning jurisdiction, concerning politics, and so on. And for this, you need small languages. We don't want to defend small languages, or at least I don't want to defend small languages just for the sake of that they're small languages. By the way, they're not small languages. Arabic is not a small language. It's just that in the Netherlands, people are not studying it. That's a different issue. So let's not be Eurocentric and call these small languages. That's just an insult. But it's about, we need those small languages, and why do we need those small languages? So that we can read those documents, and so that we can acquire historical knowledge, political knowledge, and even speculative knowledge, such as the one that was developed by Marcuse, and so that we can estimate our own situation. And this is why I think we need the humanities. That's it. Thanks.